Chapter 3 Nature of Sources and Historical Construction. The methods of archaeology help us to recover the material remains of the past relating to ancient, medieval, and modern periods of our history. In India and many other countries, archaeology is used to study prehistory and ancient history. Prehistory is concerned with the period for which there are no written sources, and history is basically based on written material. Prehistoric sites differ from historic sites in several aspects. Generally, they are not in the form of prominent habitation remains, but principally of fossils of humans, plants, and animals. They are found on the hill slopes of plateaus and mountains and on the banks of nearby rivers with terraces and comprise sundry fauna and flora. More importantly, numerous stone tools from the Stone Age have been found at these sites. The remains of tools, plants, animals, and humans from the pre-Ice Age indicate the climatic conditions that prevailed at that time. Although writing was known in India by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC in the Indus culture, it has not so far been deciphered. Thus, though the Harappans knew how to write, their culture is placed in the proto-historic phase. The same is the case with the Chalcolithic or Copper Stone Age culture, which had no writing. Decipherable writing was known in India only in the 3rd century BC, with Ashokan inscriptions providing solid evidence for historical reconstruction from that time. However, despite the critical use of Vedic and post-Vedic literary sources for history in pre-Ashokan times, archaeology remains a very important source for historians. The ancient Indians left innumerable material remains. The stone temples in South India and brick monasteries in East India still stand to remind us of the great building activities of the past. However, the major part of these remains lies buried in mounds scattered all over India. A mound is an elevated portion of land covering the remains of old inhabitants. It may be of different types: single culture, major culture, and multiculture. Single culture mounds represent only one culture throughout. Some mounds represent only the painted graveware culture, other Satavahana culture, and yet other cultures that of the Kushanas. In major culture mounds, one culture is dominant and others are of secondary importance. Multicultural mounds represent several important cultures in succession which occasionally overlap with one another. As in the case with Ramayana and Mahabharata, an excavated mound can be used to understand successive layers of the material and other aspects of a culture. A mound can be excavated vertically or horizontally. Vertical excavation means lengthwise digging or to uncover the period-wise sequence of cultures. It is generally confined to a part of the site. Horizontal excavation entails digging the mound as a whole or a major part of it. The method may enable the excavator to obtain a complete idea of the site culture in a particular period. As most sites have been dug vertically, they provide a good chronological sequence of material culture. Horizontal diggings being very expensive or very few in number, with the result that excavations do not give us a full or even adequate picture of material life in many phases of ancient Indian history. Even in those mounds which have been excavated, the ancient remains have been preserved in varying proportions in the dry arid climate of western UP, Rajasthan, and northwestern India. Antiquities are found in a better state of preservation, but in the moist and humid climate of the mid Gangetic plains and in the deltoic regions, even iron implements suffered corrosion and mud structures become difficult to detect. Only the burnt brick structures or some structures of the Gangetic plains are well preserved. Excavations have brought to light the villages that people established around 6000 BC in Balkistan. They also tell us about the material culture which was developed in the Gangetic plains in the 2nd millennium BC. They show the layout of the settlements in which people lived, the types of pottery they used, the form of house in which they dwelt, the kind of cereals they ate, and the type of tools and implements they used. Some people in South India buried in graves along with the dead, their tools, weapons, pottery, and other belongings, and these were enriched by large pieces of stones. These structures are called mahalaths. Although some mahalaths do not fall in this category, by digging them we learn of the life people lived in the Deccan from the Iron Age onwards. The science that enables us to systematically dig the successive layers of old mounds and to form an idea of the material life of the people is called archaeology. The dates are fixed by various methods. Of them, radiocarbon dating is the most important. Radiocarbon or carbon C14 is a radioactive carbon isotope which is present in all living objects. It decays like all radioactive substance at an uniform rate. When an object is living, the process of decay of carbon-14 is neutralized by absorption of carbon-14 through air and food. However, when an object ceases to be alive, its C14 content continues to decay at a uniform rate but ceases to absorb C14 from air and food. By measuring the loss of C14 content in an ancient object, its age can be determined. This is because, as stated earlier, the decay of C14 takes place at an uniform rate. It is known that half-life of C14 is 5568 years. The half-life of a radioactive material is defined as the period during which half the radioactive content in an object disappears. Thus, the C14 content in an object that ceased to live 5568 years ago would be half of that it was which it was living. And in an object which ceased to live 11,136 years ago, its C14 content would be one fourth of that it had been written it was living. It had been when it was living. But no antiquity older than 70,000 years can be dated by this method. The history of climate and vegetation is known through an examination of plant residues and especially through pollen analysis. On this basis, it is suggested that agriculture was practiced in Rajasthan and Kashmir in 7000 to 6000 BC. The nature and components of metal artifacts are analyzed scientifically and consequently the mines from which the metals were obtained are located and the stages in the development of metal technology identified. An examination of animal bones shows whether the animal was domesticated and also indicates the uses to which they put. I may add that archaeology provides a kind of soil archive which contains various material remains. However, for a total study of prehistory extending roughly up to 3000 BC or so, it is necessary to get an idea of the history of soil, rocks, etc. This is provided by geological studies. Similarly, the world of plants and animals keeps on changing through at a slow pace though at a slow pace. Their history is provided by biological studies. Human history cannot be understood without an idea of the continuing interaction between soils, plants, and animals on the one hand and humans on the other. Geological and biological advances enable us to understand not only prehistory but also history. Taken together with archaeological remains, geological and biological studies act as important source for the study of over 98% of the total time scale of history, starting with the origin of the earth. Coins. Although a large number of coins and inscriptions has been found on the surface, many of them have been unearthed by digging. The study of coins is called numismatics. Ancient Indian currency was not issued in the form of paper as it is in the case nowadays, but as metal coins. Ancient coins were made of metals like copper, silver, gold, and lead. Coin molds made of burnt clay have been discovered in large numbers. Most of them relate to the Kushan period, that is, first three Christian centuries. The use of such molds in the post-Gupta period virtually disappeared. As there was nothing like the modern banking system in ancient times, people stored money in earthenware and also in brass vessels and maintained them as precious hoards on which they could fall back in time of need. Many of these hoards contain not only Indian coins but also those minted abroad, such as Roman Empire. They have been discovered in different parts of India. They are preserved mostly in museums in Kolkata, Patna, Lucknow, Delhi, Jaipur, Mumbai and Chennai. There are many Indian coins in the museums of Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. As Britain ruled over India for a long time, Britain officials succeeded in transferring many of the Indian coins to private and public collections in Britain. Coins of the major dynasties have been catalogued and published. We have catalogues of the coins in the Indian Museum at Kolkata, Indian coins in the British Museum in London, and so on. Nonetheless, there are a large number of coins that have yet to be catalogued and published. Our earliest coins contain a few symbols, but the later coins depict the figure of kings and divinities and also mention their names and dates. The areas where they are found indicate the region of their circulation. This has enabled us to reconstruct the history of several ruling dynasties, especially of the Indo-Greeks who came to India from North Afghanistan and ruled here in the 2nd and 1st century BC. As coins were used for various purposes such as donation, as mode of payment and a medium of exchange, they throw considerable light on economic history. Some coins were issued by guilds of merchants and goldsmiths with the permission of the rulers. This shows that crafts and commerce had become important. Coins held transaction on a large scale and contributed to trade. The largest number of Indian coins date to the post-Maurya period. These were made of lead, porcelain, copper, bronze, silver and gold. The Guptas issued the largest number of gold coins. All this indicates that trade and commerce flourished, especially in post-Maurya and a good part of the Gupta period. However, only a few coins belonging to the post-Gupta period have been found, which indicates a decline of trade and commerce in that period. Coins also portray kings and gods and contain religious symbols and legends, all of which throw light on the art and religion of the time. Cowries were also used as coins. Though their purchasing power was low, they appear in substantial numbers in post-Gupta times, but many have been used earlier. Inscriptions. Far more important than coins or inscriptions, the study is called epigraphy, and the study of the old writing used in inscriptions and other old records is called paleography. Inscriptions were carved on seals, stone pillars, rocks, copper plates, temple walls, wooden tablets, and bricks or images. In India as a whole, the earliest inscriptions were recorded on stone. However, in the early centuries of Christian era, copper plate began to be used for this purpose. Even then, the practice of engraving inscriptions on stone continued on a large scale in South India. We have also in that region a large number of inscriptions recorded on the walls of temples to serve as permanent records. Like coins, inscriptions are preserved in various museums of the country, but the largest number may be found in the office of the chief epigraphist at Mysore. The earliest inscriptions were written in Prakrit in the 3rd century BC. Sanskrit was adopted as an epigraphic medium in the 2nd century BC, and its use became widespread in the 4th and 5th centuries. But even then, Prakrit continued to be used. Inscriptions began to be composed in regional languages in the 9th and 10th century. Most of the inscriptions bearing on the history of Maurya, post-Maurya and Gupta periods have been published on a series of collections called Corpus Inscriptionum Indicarum, but not many inscriptions of the post-Gupta period figure in such systematic compilations. In the case of South India, topographical list of inscriptions have been published. Still, over 50,000 inscriptions, mostly of South India, await publication. The Harappan inscriptions, which are wide decipherment, seem to have been written in a pictographic script in which ideas and objects were expressed in the form of pictures. Most Ashokan inscriptions were engraved in the Brahmi script, which were written from left to right, but some were incised in the Kharoshthi script, which was written from right to left. However, the Brahmi script prevailed virtually all over India except for northwestern part. Greek and Aramic scripts are employed in writing Ashokan inscriptions in Pakistan and Afghanistan. but Brahmis continues to be the main script till the end of Gupta times. An epigraphist can decipher most Indian inscriptions up to about the 7th century if he was mastered Brahmi and his variations. But subsequently, we notice strong regional variations in the script. Inscriptions found on the seals of Harappa belong to about 2500 BC or considered symbolic by some scholars. For Indian history, the earliest deciphered inscriptions are Iranian. They belong to the 6th to 5th century BC and are found in Iran. They appeared in Old Indo-Iranian and also in Semitic languages in the cuneiform script. They speak of the Iranian conquest of the Hindu or Sindhu area. Of course, in India, the earliest deciphered are Ashokan inscriptions. They are generally written in Brahmi script and Prakrit language in 3rd century BC. They throw light on the Maurya history and Ashoka's achievements. In the 4th century AD, two Ashokan pillar inscriptions were found by Firoz Shah Tughlaq, one in Meerut and another at a place called Topra in Haryana. He brought them to Delhi and asked the Pandits of his empire to decipher the inscriptions, but they failed to do so. The same difficulty was faced by British when in the last quarter of the 18th century they discovered Ashokan inscriptions. These epigraphs were first deciphered in 1837 by James Spencer, a civil servant in the employ of East India Company in Bengal. We have various types of inscriptions. Some convey royal orders and decisions regarding social, religious, and administrative matters to officials and other people in general. Ashokan inscriptions belong to this category. Others are votive records of followers of Buddhism, Jainism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and the like. They appear on pillars, tablets, temples, or images as marks of devotion. Yet another type elogize the attributes and achievements of kings and conquerors and ignore their defeats or weaknesses. To this category belongs the Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudragupta. Finally, we have many donative records which refer especially to gifts of money, cattle, land, etc. Mainly for religious purposes made not only by kings and princes but also by artisans and merchants. Inscriptions regarding land grants made mainly by chiefs and princes are very important for the study of the land system and administration in ancient India. These were mostly engraved on copper plates. They record grants of lands, revenues, and villages made to monks, priests, temples, monasteries, vassals, and officials. They were written in all languages, include Prakrit, Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu. Literary sources. Although ancient Indians knew how to write as early as 2500 BC, our most ancient manuscripts are not older than 4th century AD and are found in Central Asia. In India, they were written on birch bark and palm leaves, but in Central Asia, they were in Prakrit language. But in Central Asia, where the Prakrit language had spread from India, manuscripts were also written on sheep leather and wooden tablets. These writings are called inscriptions, but they are as good as manuscripts. When printing was not known, manuscripts were very highly valued. Although old Sanskrit manuscripts are found all over the India, they mostly relate to South India, Kashmir, and Nepal. Currently, inscriptions are largely preserved in museums and manuscripts in libraries. Most ancient books contain religious themes. Hindu religious literature include Vedas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Purana, and the like. They throw considerable light on the social and cultural conditions of ancient times, but it is difficult to use them in the context of time and place. The Rig Veda may be assigned to c. 1500 to 1000 BC, though such collections as the Atharva Veda, Yajur Veda, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and the Upanishads date roughly to 1000 to 500 BC. Almost every Vedic text contains interpolations which generally appear at the beginning or the end and seldom in the middle. The Rig Veda mainly comprises prayers, whereas the later Vedic text comprises prayers as well as rituals, magic, and mythological stories. However, the Upanishads contain philosophical speculations. In order to understand the Vedic text, it was necessary to study the Vedangas or the limbs of the Veda. These supplements of the Veda comprised phonetics, ritual, grammar, etymology, metrics, and astronomy. Here the phonetic is Shiksha, ritual is Kalpa, grammar is Vyakarana, etymology is Nirukta, metrics is Shanta, and astronomy is Jyotisha. And much literature grew around each of these subjects. They were written in the form of precepts in prose. A precept is a precept was called a sutra because of its brevity. The most famous example of this writing is the grammar of Panini, written around 450 BC. While illustrating the rules of grammar, Panini casts invaluable light on the society, economy, and culture of his times. The two epics and major Puranas seem to have been finally compiled by 400 AD. Of the epics, the Mahabharata attributed to Vyasa is older and possibly reflects the state of affairs from the 10th century BC to 4th century AD. Originally, it consisted of 8,800 verses and was called Jaya for a collection dealing with victory. These were increased to 24,000 and came to be known as Bharata because it contains the stories of descendants of one of the earliest Vedic tribes called Bharata. The final compilation increased the verses to 100,000, that is 1 lakh, which came to be known as Mahabharata or the Shatar Sahasri Samhita. It contains narrative, descriptive, and didactic material. The main narrative, which relates to the Kaurava Pandava conflict, may relate to the later Vedic period. The descriptive portion might be of the post Vedic period, and the didactic portion generally relate to the post Maurya and Gupta periods. Similarly, the Ramayana of Valmiki originally consisted of 6,000 verses, which were raised to 12,000 and eventually to 24,000. Although this epic appears to be more unified than Mahabharata, it too has its didactic parts which were subsequently added. The Ramayana composition started in the 5th century BC. After that, it passed through as many as 5 stages, and the 5th stage seemed to have been as late as 12th century AD. As a whole, the text seems to have been composed later than the Mahabharata. In the post-Vedic period, we have a large corpus of ritual literature, grand public sacrifices to be made by princes and men of substance belonging to the three higher varnas are set out in the Shrauta Sutras, which provide for several ostentatious royal coronation ceremonies. Similarly, domestic rituals connected with birth, naming, sacred thread, investiture, marriage, funerals, etc. are prescribed in the Griha Sutras. Both the Shrauta Sutras and Griha Sutras relate to 600 to 300 BC. Mention may also be made of the Sulka Sutras, which prescribe various kinds of measurements for the construction of sacrificial altars. They mark the beginning of the study of geometry and mathematics. The religious books of the Jainas and Buddhists refer to historical persons and incidents. The earliest Buddhist texts were written in Pali language, which was spoken in Magadha or South Bihar and was basically in form of Prakrit. They were finally compiled in the 1st century BC in Sri Lanka, but the canonical portions reflect the state of affairs in India in the age of Buddha. They tell us not only about the life of the Buddha but also about some of his royal contemporaries who ruled over Magadha, North Bihar, and eastern UP. The most important and interesting portion of the non canonical literature is provided by the stories of the previous births of Gautama Buddha. It was believed that before he was actually born as Gautama, the Buddha passed through over 550 births, in many cases in the form of animals. Each birth story is called a Jataka, which is a folk tale. The Jatakas throw invaluable light on the social and economic conditions of the period between 5th and 2nd century BC. They also make incidental references to political events in the age of the Buddha. The Jaina texts were written in Prakrit and were eventually compiled in 6th century AD in Vallabhi in Gujarat. They, however, contain many passages that help us to reconstruct the political history of eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in age of Mahavira. The Jaina text after refer repeatedly to trade and traders. We also have a large body of secular literature. To this class belong the law books called Dharma Sutras and Smritis, which together with their commentaries are called Dharma Shastras. The Dharma Sutras were compiled in 500 to 200 BC and the principal Smritis were codified in the first 6 centuries of the Christian era. They prescribed the duties to be performed by the different varnas as well as by kings and their officials. They set out the rules for marriage together with the laws according to which property is to be held, sold, and inherited. They also prescribe punishments for persons guilty of theft, assault, murder, adultery, and the like. An important law book is the Arthashastra of Kautilya. The text is divided into 15 books, of which books 2 and 3 may be regarded as beginning of an earlier date and seem to have been the work of different hands. This text was put in the final form in the beginning of Christian era, but in its earliest portions reflect the state of society and economy in the age of Mauryas. It provides rich material for the study of ancient Indian polity and economy. Of the non-religious texts, grammatical works are very important for historical construction. They begin with the Astatyati of Panini. Panini lived in the northwestern part of subcontinent. He is not mentioned in the Pali texts, which principally represent Bihar and UP. Panini is dated to around 450 BC by V.S. Agrawala, who has written about Panini's India in both Hindi and English. In his view, no other text provides as much information about the Janapada or territorial states of pre-Mauryan times as Panini does. Patanjali commentary on Panini dated 150 BC supplies valuable information about post-Maurya times. We also have the works of Bhasha, Sutraka, Kalidasa and Banabhatta apart from their literary value. They mirror the conditions of the times to which their writers belonged. The works of Kalidasa comprise kavyas and dramas, the most famous of which is Abhigna Abhinanasha Kundalam. Abhinanyana Sahundalam. Abhinyana Sahundalam. Sorry, the words of Kalidasa comprise kavyas and dramas, and most famous of which is Abhinyana Sahundalam. Besides being great creative compositions, they provide us with glimpses of social and cultural life of Guptas. In addition to Sanskrit sources, we have some of the earliest Tamil texts in the corpus of Sangam literature. This literature was produced over a period of 3 to 4 centuries by poets who assembled in colleges patronized by chiefs and kings. Such colleges were called Sangam, and the literature produced in these assemblies was known as Sangam literature. The compilation of the corpus is attributed to the first 4 Christian centuries, although they were really completed by the 6th century. The Sangam literature comprises about 30,000 lines of poetry arranged in 8 anthologies called Ettu Togai. The poems are collected in groups of hundreds such as the poems are collected in group of hundreds such as Purananuru, that is the 400 of the exterior, There are two main groups, Padran Kelkanaku, the 18 lower collections, and Pattu Pattu, the 10 songs. The former is generally assumed to be older than the latter and hence is considered to be of great historical importance. The Sangam texts have several layers, but at present these cannot be established on the basis of style and content, but as shown later, they can be detected on the basis of stages in social evolution. The Sangam texts are different from the Vedic texts, particularly the Rig Veda. They do not constitute religious literature. The short and long poems were composed by numerous poets in praise of various heroes and heroines and thus secular in nature. They are not primitive songs but literature of high quality. Many poems mention a warrior or a chief or a king by name and describe in detail his military exploits. The gifts made by him to bards and warriors are celebrated. These poems may have been recited in the courts. They are compared with the heroic poetry of the Homeric age, for they represent a heroic age of warriors and battles. It is difficult to use these texts for historical purposes. Perhaps the proper names, titles, dynasties, territories, wars, and the like mentioned in the poems are partly real. Some of the Chera kings mentioned in the Sangam text also appear as donas and inscriptions of the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Sangam texts refer to many settlements, including Kaveri Pattanam, whose flourishing existence has now been archaeologically corroborated. They also speak of the Yavanas coming in their own vessels, purchasing pepper with gold, and supplying wine and women slaves to the natives. This trade is known not only from Latin and Greek writings but also from the archaeological record. The Sangam literature is a major source of our information for the social, economic, and political life of the people living in the deltoid Tamil Nadu in the early Christian centuries. What it says about trade and commerce is confirmed by foreign accounts and archaeological finds. Foreign accounts. Indigenous literature can be supplemented by foreign accounts. To India came Greek, Roman, and Chinese visitors either as travelers or religious converts, and they left behind accounts of the things that they saw. It is remarkable that Alexander's invasion finds no mention in Indian sources, and it is entirely on the basis of Greek sources that we have to reconstruct the history of Indian exploits. The Greek writers mention Sandrokotas, a contemporary of Alexander the Great, who invaded India in 326 BC. Prince Sandrokota is identified with Chandragupta Maurya, whose date of accession is fixed at 322 BC. This identification has served as the sheet anchor in ancient Indian chronology. The Indica of Megasthenes, who came to the court of Chandragupta Maurya, has been preserved only in fragments quoted by subsequent classical writers. Those fragments, when read together, furnish valuable information not only about the system of Maurya administration but also about social classes and economic activities in the Maurya period. The Indica is not free from credulity and exaggeration, which is true of many other ancient accounts. Greek and Roman accounts of the 1st and 2nd centuries mention many Indian ports and enumerate items of trade between India and the Roman Empire. The Periples of the Erythraean Sea and Ptolemy geography, both written in Greek, provide valuable data for the study of ancient geography and commerce. The date ascribed to the first ranges between AD 80 and 105, whereas the second is attributed to about AD 150. The Periples of the Erythraean Sea, which was written by the anonymous author, describes the Roman trade in the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Pliny's Naturalis Historia, which relates to the 4th century, was written in Latin and tells us about trade between India and Italy. The last Greco-Roman scholar who wrote on India was called Cosmos Indicoplestrus. He hailed from Alexandria, a center of Hellenistic culture in Egypt. Around 550, He wrote a Christian topography which mentions Christians in India and Sri Lanka and also refers to horse trade. Of the Chinese travelers, mention may be made of Faxian and Huzan Sang. Both of them were Buddhist and came to this country to visit Buddhist shrines and to study Buddhism. The first came in the beginning of the 5th century and the second in the second quarter of the 7th century. Faxian describes the social, religious, and economic conditions in India in the age of Gupta, and Huzan Sang presents a similar account of India in the age of Harsha. Village study. Relics of communal sharing in feasts, festivals, and pujas throw light on the egalitarian character of ancient tribal society. Loyalty to the clan and caste persists to this day. Survivals of rituals give us an idea of ancient sex and also of the institutions of marriage and family. High caste people do not milk the cow and never take to the plough. Their contempt for manual labor promotes untouchability. Strong traces of inequality are not confined to castes alone but also colored the relationship between man and woman. Till the 1930s, even the sati system prevailed in rural parts of Bihar. Thus, social inequalities which prevailed despite universal suffrage indicate the nature of ancient Indian society. Rural rituals and caste prejudice illustrate many of the Dharma Shastra rules governing our ancient polity and society. The use of these findings of social sciences started about 30 years ago for the historical construction of ancient India. Recently, the use of natural sciences has begun. Evidence from chemistry, geology, and biology has become relevant to the study of ancient India. Historical sense. Ancient Indians are charged with a lack of sense of history. It is evident that they didn't write history in the manner it is done today, nor did they write it in the way the Greeks did. We have a sort of history in the Puranas, which are 18 in number. 18 was a conventional term. Though encyclopedic in content, the Puranas provide dynasty history up to the beginning of the Gupta rule. They mention the places where the events took place and sometimes discuss their causes and effects. Statements about events are made in the future tense, although they were recorded much after the events that occurred. The authors of the Puranas were not unaware of the idea of change, which is the essence of history. The Puranas speak of 4 ages called Krita, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. Each succeeding age is depicted as worse than the preceding one, and as one age slides into the other, moral values and some social institutions degenerate. The importance of time and place, vital elements in history, is indicated. It is said that dharma becomes adharma and vice versa in accordance with changes in times and place. Several eras according to which events were recorded were started in ancient India. Vikrama Samvat began in 57 to 8 BC, Shaka Samvat in 78 AD, and the Gupta era in 319 AD. Inscriptions record events in the context of time and place. During the 3rd century BC, Ashokan inscriptions demonstrate considerable historical sense. Ashoka ruled for 37 years. His inscriptions record events that happened from the 8th to 27th regional year. To date, events relating to only 9 regional years figures in the inscription that have been discovered. Future discoveries may throw light on events relating to the remaining years of his reign. Similarly, in the 1st century BC, Karavela of Kalinga records a large number of events in his life year by year in the Hadikumpa inscription. Indians display a considerable historical sense in biographical writings, a good example of which is the composition of the Harsha Charita by Banabhata in the 7th century. It is a semi-biographical work written in an ornate style which became the despair of later imitators. It describes the early career of Harshavardhana, although highly exaggerated. It gives an excellent idea of court life under Harsha and the social and religious life in his stage. Later, several other charitas or biographies were written. Sandhyakara Nandi's Ramacharita narrates the story of conflict between Kaivarta peasants and the Pala prince Ramapala, resulting in the latter's victory. Bilhana's Vikramanka Devacharita recounts the achievements of this patron. Vikramaditya, the Chalukya king of Kalyan, even the biographies of some merchants of Gujarat were written in AD 12th to 13th centuries. Similar historical works may have been written in South India, but thus far only one such account has been discovered. This is called Mushika Vamsa and was written by Adula in 11th century. It is an account of the dynasty of Mushikas which ruled in northern Kerala. However, the best example of the earliest historical writing is provided by the Raja Tarangini or the Stream of Kings written by Kalhana in the 12th century. It is a string of biographies of kings of Kashmir and can be considered to be the first work to possess several characteristics of historical writing as it is understood today. Constructing history. So far, numerous sites, prehistoric, protohistoric, and historical, have been excavated and explored, but the results do not find a place in the mainstream of ancient Indian history. The stages of social evolution in India cannot be properly comprehended without taking into account the results of prehistoric and prohistoric archaeology. Not to speak of historical archaeology, although nearly 200 sites relating to the ancient historical period have been excavated, yet their relevance to the study of the social, economic, and cultural trends in ancient times has not been adequately discussed in survey studies. This needs to be done both in the context of the rural and urban aspects of ancient India. So far, the significance of largely Buddhist and some Brahmanical sites has been highlighted, but religious history needs to be seen in relation to social and economic developments. Ancient history has so far been constructed principally on the basis of literary sources, foreign and indigenous. Coins and inscription play some part, but the text receive greater weightage. Now, new methods must be adopted. Historical knowledge keeps growing. We have to be more critical about the dates and content of the text. This may be done if we examine the text in the context of archaeological evidence. Initially, archaeologists were inspired by written text, and several sites mentioned in the Brahmanical and Buddhist texts were excavated. This immensely enriched historical information, though the digging results didn't always confirm the contents of the text. Though full-length reports of many excavated sites are yet to be published, it is advisable to examine the text in the context of archaeological findings. For the study of the age of Rigveda, we have to take into account of Gandhara grave culture, in which the horse was used and the dead were cremated in the 2nd millennium BC. We have to establish a correlation between later Vedic age on the other hand and the painted grey ware and other types of archaeological finds. On the other, similarly, early Pali texts have to be related to the northern black polished ware NBPW archaeology. Besides, the information derived from the Sangam text needs to be correlated with that inferred from inscriptions and early megalithic archaeology in Peninsular India. Archaeological evidence should be considered far more important than the long family trees found in the Puranas. The Puranic tradition could be used to date Rama of Ayodhya to around 2000 BC. But diggings and extensive explorations in Ayodhya do not show any settlement around that date. Similarly, although Krishna plays an important role in Mahabharata, the earliest inscriptions and sculptural pieces from Madura between 200 BC and 300 AD do not attest to its presence. Given such difficulties, the ideas of an epic age based on Ramayana and Mahabharata must be discarded. Although in the past it formed a chapter in the most survey volumes of ancient India. Of course, several stages of social evolution in both the Ramayana and Mahabharata can be detected. This is so because the epics do not belong to a single phase of social evolution. We may recall that they have undergone several editions. Further, on the basis of literary traditions and epigraphic material, Vardhamana, Mahavira, and Gautama Buddha are generally dated to the 6th century BC, but the cities they visited are archaeologically not older than 400 BC, and therefore the tradition based dates of these great personalities need to be reconsidered. On chronological and rational grounds, archaeology, inscriptions, and coins are more important than texts. However, the grammatical works of Panini and Patanjali have almost fixed dates, and they are comparatively free from myths and legends and are therefore as important as coins, inscriptions, and the results of excavations. Many inscriptions have to be dated between dismissed on the ground that they are of little historical value. Historical value is taken to mean information necessary to reconstruct political history. However, a royal inscription contains exaggerations. The term hundreds of thousands seems to be a clinch in Ashokan inscription. It is applied to people and animals and raises doubts about the number of the people killed in the Kalinga War and those brought to Pataliputra. These are exaggerations too in the inscriptions of Samudragupta and King Chandra. Despite these exaggerations in comparison to Puranic tradition, the inscriptions are certainly more reliable. Thus, though the Puranas are used to push back the origin of Shatavahanas, the inscription places it in the 1st century BC. Inscriptions may indicate the regional period of a king, his conquest, and his extent, but they also reveal trends in the development of polity, society, economy, and religion. This study, therefore, doesn't use inscription merely for political or religious history. Epigraphic land grants are valued not for the family trees and lists of conquest, but more importantly for the rise of new states and changes in the social and agrarian structure, particularly in post-Gupta times. Similarly, coins need to be used not only for the reconstruction of the history of the Indo-Greeks, Shakas, Satavahanas and Kushans, but also for the history of trade and urban life. In sum, a careful collection of the material derived from the texts, coins, inscriptions, archaeology, etc. is essential for historical reconstruction. We have been that this raises the problem of the relative importance of the sources. Thus, coins, inscriptions, and archaeology are considered more important than mythologies found in the epics and Puranas. Mythologies may support dominant norms, validate social mores, and justify privileges and disabilities of people organized in caste and other social groups, but the events described in them cannot be taken to be true. Past practices can also be explained with the help of some ancient survivals in our own times. Familiarity with village life and insights derived from the study of primitive people are valuable assets in the construction of ancient history. A sound historical reconstruction cannot ignore developments in other ancient societies. A comparative view may remove the obsession with the idea of the rare or unique in ancient India and may bring out those trends that ancient India shares with the past society of other countries. We may also use the results of human genetic research to learn about Indian connection with people in different parts of the world. A scientific study of hereditary and generation-wise inherited traits indicate ethnic mixture, dispersal of population, and dissemination of culture. Chronology. 3rd millennium BC, writing enters the Indus culture. 1500 to 1000, Rig Veda came. 1000 to 500, Yajur Veda, Atharva Veda, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads came. 600 to 300, Shrauta Sutras and Grihya Sutras came. 6th century, Mahavira and Buddha as per literature. 500 to 200, Dharma Sutras. 450, Grammar of Pranini. 5th century, Mahavira and the Buddha in the context of archaeology. 326, Alexander's invasion. 322, accession of Chandragupta Maurya. 3rd century, decipherable writing in India. 57 AH, Vikrama Samvat. 1st century, Hadihumpa inscription of Karavela of Kalinga. 1st century, the earlier Pali Buddhist text compiled in Sri Lanka. 1st century AD, the Arthashastra of Kautilya finally compiled. 78 AD, start of Shaka Samvat. 80 to 115 AD, the Periplus of Erythraean Sea. 150 AD, Ptolemy's geography. 319 AD, start of Gupta era. 400 AD, Mahabharata, Ramayana and major Puranas finally compiled. 4th century AD, earliest Indian manuscript found in Central Asia. 5th century AD, Persian come to India. 6th century, the Prakrit China text finally compiled in Valapi. 7th century, Swangswang visit Harshacharya by Banabhatta. 11th century, Mushika Vamsha by Ajullah. 11th to 12th century, Vikramanka Devacharita by Bilhana. 12th century, Ramacharita by Sandhyakara Nandi. Raja Tarangini by Kalhana. 1837, Ashokan inscription first deciphered by James Spencer. Thank you.